Welcome to Sobol Says for Parshas Vayechi, as well as for Asara B'Teves. We will, of course, do a quick overview of the Parsha, stop a couple of places along the way, but then mainly focus on the upcoming fast day, as well as perhaps its surprising connection to our Parsha. So, as we famously know, the Parsha begins with Yaakov getting ill, in the sense that he is now preparing to die. Historically, you should know Yaakov is the first person to get ill before he passes away. That was at his request, simply because he wanted to have an opportunity to put his affairs in order, specifically the spiritual affairs of the nation that he had begun the creation of, and therefore he asks and Hashem grants that he become ill, so he has time to address his children, and in this Parsha, of course, he gives them the blessings before he expires. So, we know perhaps the most famous of all the blessings, of course, happens in this week's Parsha, and it's famous simply because many parents have the custom to do this every Friday night, as well as Erev Yom Kippur, to bless their children. And the language for the blessing of a son is found in this week's Parsha, where where Yaakov blesses Ephraim and Manasseh. And they become our paradigm for our blessings, that we wish our sons to become like Ephraim and Manasseh. There are many different reasons given for why, out of all the characters in history that we could bless our children to be like, that we choose Ephraim and Manasseh. I think last year on the video we went over one or two of them. We won't spend much time on them today. The main one that I would just focus on and remember again is that Ephraim and Manasseh were the first Jews that were born in Gullus, in exile. And we see extraordinarily, actually, against all odds, frankly, that they were able to survive intact with their surroundings being Mitzrayim, which was an extraordinary thing, as we said. So we bless our children, especially even in Eretz Yisrael. We're still in Gullus now, but certainly outside of Eretz Yisrael, that we hope and we wish that our children too, notwithstanding the environment that they are raised in, be able to be like Ephraim and Manasseh, who were perfectly righteous even in the confines of the evil Egypt, and ultimately became on the level of the Shvatim. So they not only did not go down, they maintained the same level that their father Yosef had, and that is why they become the paradigm for our blessing of our children. Then comes the blessings of all the tribes. I put that in quotes because if you take a look at them, certainly the first few, it doesn't feel very blessing-like. Yaakov actually laces into Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, and does some spiritual housekeeping with them, criticizing them for certain moves they did, but nonetheless everything is for a bracha, and certainly anything that came out of Yaakov's mouth was a bracha. And we see in general, and very importantly, that Yaakov didn't just give generic and general brachos to his children. Each one was customized to assist that child to achieve their particular potential, for them to be able to fill their particular role, understanding, of course, as Yaakov did, that he had now created all the progenitors of Bnei Yisrael, and each would represent a different function and facet of the nation, and therefore when we all have the achdus, when we all are together, we are able to achieve all that is expected from us in that regard. So that is why they are very specifically tailored. Then Yaakov makes Yosef swear to bury him in Maras HaMachpelah. A lot of commentators ask, why he needs to make Yosef swear. Of course, I mean, we should assume that he would be able to trust him. We actually went a different direction last year and talked about the significance of that, as well as the dialogue between Yaakov and Yosef that leads up to it. If you want to go over that, I encourage you to watch last year's Sobol Says video on Parshas Vayechi, and you will be enlightened in that regard. Here, the one aspect that we wanted to focus on is the reason why he made Yosef swear is as follows. The Medrash tells us that when Paro first encounters Yosef, and after he designates him as the viceroy, Yosef went up to his throne. Now, the Medrash tells us Paro had what we could only refer to as a magic throne. It had certain magical and mystical powers to it. The way it worked was it had 70 steps that led up to the throne. And then there was an area behind the throne. The area behind the throne, even Paro was not able to access. And the reason why was because the way it was created, and obviously we understand in those days they did have different capabilities in terms of black magic, etc. Each step required a person to speak a particular language in order to be able to access that step. The step would then come out for the person. So if you knew all 70 languages, then you would be able to come up all the way to the throne. And that is what Paro was able to do, and therefore he was able to sit in the throne. Yosef, when Yosef then was asked to approach him, Yosef was not only able to go all 70 steps up to the throne, but the Medrash tells us that Yosef knew one additional language that Paro did not, and that was Lashon HaKodesh. The 70 languages of the nations did not include Lashon HaKodesh, what we loosely refer to as Hebrew, that which the Torah is written in, and therefore when Yosef approached Paro, he then was actually able to access the 71st step, or the area behind it, which was very embarrassing and threatening to Paro. Nobody bore witness because he was already all the way up there, but Paro was certainly thrown off by that fact, because obviously you could imagine that would seem to allow Yosef to challenge the authority of Paro by being able to show he could access even a greater part of the throne than Paro could. Paro therefore makes Yosef swear to him that he will not disclose the fact that he knew an additional language over and above Paro, and that he could access the final area of the throne, which Yosef agrees to do. That's why, if you look back in Parshas Miketz, that Paro says to Yosef, page 228, pasuk 40, he says, "Atati al beisiv al bicha yisha kol ami raka kisei egdal mimeka." So he says, you will be the Lord over everything, you'll be in charge of everything, my powers and my command, only by the throne shall I outrank you. That was a reference to the fact that because Paro could only get to the throne, it was only by the throne that he outranked him, a subtle statement that really Yosef could therefore go past the throne and outrank Paro. Nonetheless, he makes him swear, which he does. Now, when he comes to Paro, and this was very critical that Yaakov made him swear, because when he comes to Paro to say, my father made me swear that I would bury him in Eretz Yisrael outside of Egypt, obviously that was very bad news for Paro. He wanted to have the holy and righteous Yaakov, who they felt would be a miraculous addition to Mitzrayim that would be very beneficial for Mitzrayim. So he was not happy to hear this. So when Yosef says it to him, he tells Yosef, big deal, go break your oath. I know that you have Jewish courts with which you can nullify your vows. Please go nullify your vow to your father and have him buried here. To which Yosef replied, Okay, great, no problem. But if I'm already going to be doing Hataras Nedarim, you understand I'm going to take care of all my vows, all my oaths that I took, which would include the oath I took about your throne, at which point Paro says, go gesunter heit, bury your father in good health in Eretz Yisrael. And then sure enough, Yaakov expires. We say expires because, of course, very famously, it tells us Yaakov Avinu lo meis, that Yaakov Avinu did not die. There are many explanations on that. We're not going to go into it this year, but precisely what that means. But nonetheless, it says that Yaakov expired. And then at the very end of the Parsha, on page, 288, the last pasuk says, Vayomas Yosef ben Mea ve'eser shanim vayachantu oso vayisem ba'aram b'Mitzrayim. That Yosef had died at the age of 110 years, and they embalmed him. Says the Medrash on this pasuk, noting the fact that Yosef died at the age of 110, which was by far the youngest of all the Shvatim, of all his brothers. So the Medrash very mysteriously says, because he embalmed his father Yaakov, therefore he died earlier than his brothers. That's what the Medrash tells us. And of course, it's referencing the fact that earlier in the Parsha, it says that when when Yaakov expired, that Yosef had him embalmed. So now it's a very hard medrash to understand because embalming Yaakov would seem to be an act of great honor afforded to Yaakov, because in those days only the royalty was embalmed. And therefore that would have seemed to have been a very respectful thing for Yosef to do. So the question is, what is the Medrash telling us precisely? So the Chanukas Torah offers a fantastic answer that only he can. And he says the following idea. Why is that? So as we said, we hold Yaakov Avinu lo meis, that Yaakov Avinu did not die. Now the general understanding was in those days, certainly for the Avos, but it could be extended to the Shvatim, that they were traditionally expected to live at least as long as their father did. So for instance, in the case of Avraham expired at the age of 175, Yitzchak expired at the age of 180. Okay, so that was equal to or greater than his father. Yaakov, it seems to be, based on the psukim over here, it seems to be that Yaakov was 147 years old when he passed away. Well, we'll call it expired. He was 147 years old. Now, there is a Zohar, which we all know, actually. You may not know it's a Zohar, but it's a very famous medrash. And the Zohar tells us the following. David HaMelech was supposed to die at birth. King David, they saw in the future, would die at birth. However, he was given 70 years by someone to last on this earth. Now, the more famous of the two options that the Zohar offers is that Adam Harishon himself gave David those 70 years. Adam was destined to live till the year 1000, till the age of 1000. When he looked at all the neshamos that would in the future of the world be created, he saw the sublime soul of David HaMelech and saw it was destined to die at birth, and therefore Adam contributed 70 years of his life. There is a second answer given, and that is the following, that it was actually Yosef and Yaakov that contributed their years to David HaMelech. How did that work? So if we say that Yitzchak was 180 years old, that was the expectation for Yaakov as well, that he would live till 180. However, he seems to live until 147, which would appear to be 33 years less than he was expected to live. Now, we can only say that he could contribute those 33 years if we hold that Yaakov actually died. If we hold that Yaakov never died, then there's no way he could have contributed any years. So therefore, we have to say it must be that he died. How do we hold that he died? It says that Yosef embalmed him. So clearly Yosef held that his father was dead. If Yosef embalmed him at the age of 147, where he locks in his age, that means Yaakov has 33 years to give to David HaMelech. Therefore, now we can understand the Medrash. The Medrash says that Yosef died at the age of 110, younger than his other brothers, because he embalmed his father. Meaning, because he embalmed him, he locked him in at 147, which means that he gave 33 years to David, which means there was still another 37 years that needed to be contributed to David's life. How old was Yosef when he dies? The Torah tells us 110, which is 37 years less than his father Yaakov. And therefore, says the Medrash, that is our proof that Yaakov and Yosef together, it equals 70 years that they gave up. But we can only say that if we say he embalmed his father, and that's what caused it, because he locked in the end. And as one final little kicker proof to this, if you look at the first 5 words of Parsha Shmos, the next sefer that we begin, Eile Shmos B'nei Yisrael Habaim. If you look at the terminal letters of those first 5 words, meaning the last of each, it's a Hey, a Tav, a Yud, a Lamed, and a Mem. If you jumble those, that spells Tehillim. Tehillim being, of course, the most famous of all David HaMelech's work. So they say this Parsha ends that Yosef died. The next Parsha begins with a reference to Tehillim and David HaMelech to show us, in fact, that it was Yosef and Yaakov that contributed those 70 years. Finally, we know that the brothers approach Yosef with a message from the grave that their father said to apologize to Yosef and he should forgive him, and then they apologize themselves. And what happens? Yosef consoles them. He comforts them by telling them it was all God's will and it all worked out for the best. Hatachas Elokim Anochi. Am I instead of God? I'm not going to take revenge on you. I'm not a substitute for God. I understand this was all the divine plan. So the Rabbeinu Bachai notes something very interesting, though. If you look carefully, we generally get the sense that Yosef forgave the brothers, right? If you don't look too carefully in the text, and I ask you, what happened at the end of the Parsha? Does Yosef forgive the brothers? Everybody's going to tell you yes. But in fact, a careful reading of the text does not show anywhere that he forgives them. He says, it's okay, don't worry, but he doesn't forgive them. And Chazal tell us that if you don't get true forgiveness for harming someone, you are not fully forgiven. As a result, certain tragedies that we suffered, such as the 10 martyrs, for instance, may have come as a result of this. That was Yosef's mistake, and the brothers, I guess, for not following up. If we ask forgiveness from someone and the person responds, don't worry, it was nothing, no biggie, that's not good enough. You must get confirmation that the person actually forgives you. And that is an important lesson for the wronged person as well. If you're the victim of a hurt, if you downplay the person's actions, right, I'm not saying that you have to be cruel to them and drag them through the mud, but they may begin to think what they did was not so bad, which may prevent them from doing teshuvah, or worse, they may repeat their actions again. So while Yosef telling the brothers it was all Hashem's will seems like a kind act, in fact, they may have begun not regretting their actions and thinking even perhaps what they did was good, which prevented a full and complete teshuvah, the ramifications of which we still may be experiencing to this very day. Thus ends the Parsha, and now I want to go back to the very beginning of the Parsha, to the first pasuk, or more accurately, to the first Rashi. And we're going to learn something pretty fascinating. On page 268. So, first pasuk says, as we mentioned, Vayechi Yaakov beretz Mitzrayim sheva v'esrei shana v'yihi me Yaakov shnei chayav sheva shanim v'arba'im u'me'as shana. So it's telling us that Yaakov lived until the age of 147. So there is a very interesting Rashi over here, as well as a comment on the Rashi. So Rashi says what? Vayechi Yaakov lama parsha zo sesuma. Why is this parsha section closed up? We're going to come back to that to discuss what that means. The fisha kevan sheniftar Yaakov Avinu nistumu eineim libam shal Yisrael mitzaras ashibud shizchilu lishabdam. So first it says, why were they closed up? Because when Yaakov passed away, the eyes and the hearts of the children of Israel, of Bnei Yisrael, became closed up from the misery of the bondage that the Mitzrim had begun to impose on them. Dvar acher, shebikesh legalos es haketz levanav v'nistam mimenu. Another explanation, Yaakov wished to reveal to his sons when the end of days would be, meaning when Mashiach was coming, but it was concealed from him. He lost his nevuah at that moment. So we learn three things from this Rashi. The first is that Parshas Vayechi is what's called a Parsha Stuma, a closed Parsha, so to speak. We're going to discuss in a moment what that means exactly. The second is that when Yaakov Avinu passed away, which he was imminently about to do, the eyes and hearts of Bnei Yisrael became darkened or closed up. A play on the word stuma. Just like the Parsha is closed, so were their eyes and hearts closed, from the bondage that the Mitzrim began to impose on them. And the third thing we learn is that Yaakov wanted to reveal when Mashiach would come, but his prophetic vision was closed and it was concealed from him. So now to explain exactly what a Parsha Stuma is, you have to understand the way the Torah is written. As a general rule, every new Parsha in the Torah has a new line, a space in between the end of the prior Parsha and the beginning of the next Parsha. But you need to have at least a minimum of 9 letters. The space of what 9 letters would be, that must be the minimum separation between the end of a prior Parsha and the beginning of the next one. Why that is, they say because Moshe wanted to reflect upon that Parsha before he went on to the next one, whatever the case may be. But so generally the term Parsha Stuma refers to a Parsha separated from the previous section by the space of 9 letters, but it could still be on the same line. So for instance, a Parsha ends over here, you need at least a 9 letter space, and then on that same line, you could start again. When it's on the same line, but it's just a 9 letter separation, that's called a Parsha Stuma. That's called a closed Parsha. Here in Vayechi, it's even more severe. Here, however, it refers to the fact that there is no dividing space whatsoever between this Parsha and the previous one. Vayigash ends, Vayechi begins, and you can't tell that it's a new Parsha. As a matter of fact, watch this week in Shul. You'll see the level of expertise of the Gabbaim and the Baal Koreh based on whether there is a pause, whether the Baal Koreh needs to search after the bracha to see where the Parsha begins, because it's very hard to pick this one out. Normally it's very easy, it's identifiable in the column where the Parsha is going to begin. It's one of a few separated sections at most. Here, it's a regular run-on like any other line where Parshas Vayechi begins. So sometimes they have difficulty finding it. Anyway, if that's the case, how do we know, in fact, that Parshas Vayechi is a new Parsha? Right? I mean, if we're given the instructions for how the Torah works, here's how it works. Parshios need to start on a new line. If they start on the same line, but they're separated by 9 letters, it's called a Parsha Stuma. Those are the instructions. We've got them. But now all of a sudden, we have this weird situation. Here, Parshas Vayechi purportedly is the beginning of a new Parsha, but it doesn't follow any of the rules. It's on the same line, and there's no division of 9-letter space. So how do we even know that Parshas Vayechi is a new Parsha? So the Mizrahi, which is a super commentary on Rashi, a super commentary being a commentary on a commentary. So the Mizrahi asks that very question. He asks, how do we know that this is indeed a separate Parsha? We're going to come back to this a little later on. The second point the Mizrahi makes is with respect to Rashi's statement that the misery of the bondage or the slavery began at this time. That's another surprising statement by Rashi because we happen to know otherwise. Says the Mizrahi, in fact, the Mitzrayim's enslavement of the children of Yisrael did not begin until well after Yosef's death. For the Medrash in Shmos Rabbah tells us that as long as any of Yosef's brothers were still alive, the bondage did not commence. Not only didn't it begin until after the passing of Yosef, but for so long as any of the Shvatim were alive, no slavery. It says, nevertheless, in spite of Yosef's authority and the honor due to him, there was already an underlying movement among the Mitzrayim to draw the children of Yisrael gradually into voluntary subservience. This the children of Yisrael foresaw would lead to slavery, which they had been told by their forefathers would eventually come upon them. So that's very interesting. So the Mizrahi tells us Rashi is not meant to be taken literally. That in fact, the bondage did not start yet, but already the brothers could see the writing on the wall. And so we see from the Mizrahi that these things don't just happen overnight, right? Already the seeds of slavery have been sown at this time. And we see that, unfortunately, from our modern day history as well in Nazi Germany. Of course, as we know, the concentration camps didn't pop up overnight. It began, frankly, in World War I. There were already a lot of signs of restricting Jews' rights. And then, of course, we know, infamously in 1933, they passed many laws which restricted Jewish ownership of businesses, etc. That, in turn, led to Kristallnacht, and then eventually it leads to the concentration camps. So we see it's not like that could happen overnight. It's a succession of events that continue to devolve until we find ourselves in that dangerous situation. We're going to come back to this as well to reflect on its significance. Now, as you're all aware, this week was, I guess depends on what time you're watching the video, it will be Asara B'Teves. On Thursday, we observe the fast of the 10th of Teves. Now, Asara B'Teves is a unique fast day, in that it is the only fast nowadays that can come out on a Friday. I don't know if you recall a few years ago, I don't remember how many, has to be within the last 5 years or so, we had a Friday Asara B'Teves. Very weird, breaking your fast on the Kiddush one. I remember it doesn't happen that often, but it does happen. Now, in actuality, Chazal tell us, and this is a shocker, that if Asara B'Teves would fall out on Shabbos, we would have to fast then as well. That's a huge surprise, because of course, as you well know, the only other fast day like that, which interestingly also comes out on the 10th of the month, is Yom Kippur. Every other fast day, including Tisha B'Av, if it falls out on Shabbos, it is a nidcha. We push it off until Sunday. Or in the case of Tanis Esther, we push it back to Thursday. But we do not fast on Shabbos, other than Yom Kippur. But Chazal tell us that were Asara B'Teves to fall out on Shabbos, we would fast then as well. Now, ironically, by the way, due to our manipulation of the calendar, Asara B'Teves can never come out on Shabbos. Okay? They manipulated the calendar in such a way that it will never fall out on a Shabbos. However, were it to do so, then we would fast. And Yom Kippur, interestingly, cannot come out on a Friday
or a Sunday. But it's interesting, it cannot come out on a Friday, so it's manipulated not to come out on a Friday, but it does come out on Shabbos and we fast. But were it to come out on a Friday, we would fast as well. And Asara B'Teves is manipulated so that it not come out on Shabbos, but if it were, we would fast on Shabbos, and we do fast on Friday, Asara B'Teves. Now, just as an aside, the reason why they manipulate the calendar so that Yom Kippur never come out on a Friday or a Sunday is simply because there are only 2 days where there is a complete Isser of Malacha, where we are not allowed to do any Malacha, and that is Shabbos and Yom Kippur. The other holidays we are allowed to do Malacha. Of course, we know we're allowed to cook. We have less restrictions. The reason why the Chachamim manipulated it so that Yom Kippur would never come out on a Friday or a Sunday is because we do not want to have 2 consecutive days where there is a complete Isser of Malacha. That would be very bad, first of all, for food. Right? People, especially in those days, that would be very difficult if you had a true Isser Malacha, again, as opposed to Yontiv, in which case you can cook. And the second day of Yontiv, or whatever the case may be in some circumstances, even the first, you can bury the dead. Yom Kippur, you're not allowed to bury the dead. Shabbos, you're not allowed to bury the dead. And therefore, out of Kavod HaMeis, out of respect to the dead, they made sure that Yom Kippur and Shabbos do not fall out on consecutive days. But clearly, there's a connection between these 2 days, between the 10th day of Tishrei, which we call Yom Kippur, and the 10th day of Teves. Now, if you're thinking, like, why would we want to talk about 10th of Teves now, right? Because odds are you're either watching this during or almost at the end of your fast, or more likely a day or 2 or more after it, and you think that maybe I have missed my opportunity, I should have said it last week. Well, if that's what you're thinking, then that's because we have a fundamental misunderstanding of what the 10th of Teves is all about. So I thought we would spend the rest of the class here discussing Asara B'Teves, its source, its connection to our Parsha, and the questions we asked before, and its relevance to today and beyond. So why do we fast on Asara B'Teves? And why is it so important that we fast even on a Friday, and even on a Shabbos as well? So in actuality, we fast on the 10th of Teves due to 3 different tragedies that occurred. And although we were really supposed to have 3 consecutive fast days, because the tragedies occurred on the 8th of Teves, the 9th of Teves, and the 10th of Teves, the Chachamim felt that it would be too much for us to fast 3 days in a row. And so they consolidated them into 1 day on the 10th. But the tragedies were as follows. On the 8th of Teves is when the Septuagint was written. The Septuagint is a fancy word for the translation of the Torah into Greek. It was commanded by King Ptolemy, who was a Greek king of Egypt. So I guess he liked the Greek language, but he was the Egyptian king. And as we know, infamously, he made 70 different, the greatest sages of their time, sit in separate rooms and each translate the Torah into Greek. The Gemara goes over a number of miracles that occurred because everybody was separated because the king wanted to make sure they were authentic translations and was concerned that the Chachamim would share answers with each other, so to speak. So he separated them. And yet it says a number of miracles happened during that time where all of those Chachamim had Ruach HaKodesh to change certain things, and they all did it consistently. The most famous one, they changed the beginning of the Torah. Instead of it saying Bereshis bara Elokim, they said Elokim bara as Bereshis, something like that. They changed it around. Why? Because otherwise, if you took a literal translation of that, it would sound like Bereshis bara Elokim. This thing called Bereshis, this entity, this perhaps God, called Bereshis bara Elokim. He created God. And then God created the world. So obviously, because they were concerned about that misinterpretation, they switched the words around. There's other stories, for instance, talking about animals, a tamei animal, I believe it was the Arneves. They switch it to being a Torah animal or something because that happened to be the name of the queen, and they were afraid if they would say something derogatory about that animal, the king would take it as a slight, etc. There were a number of miracles that occurred. But nonetheless, it tells us that that was a day that darkness descended into the world when the Chachamim were forced to translate the Torah into Greek. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. On the 9th of Teves, Ezra and Nehemiah both died. Okay, I don't think in the same year, but they both died on the 9th of Teves. And it is specifically with Ezra's passing that marked the absolute end to prophecy. Ezra was the finale. Upon his passing, so passed prophecy. Some say he's Malachi, from Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi. In any event, it tells us clearly when Ezra passed away, the prophecy ended. Now, who was Ezra? So Ezra, you should know, just for a timeline, after the Purim story, when we are now free to come back to the Beis HaMikdash and continue its rebuilding, as well as to resettle Eretz Yisrael, Ezra leads the charge. Ezra tries to get everybody to come back. He was the first Nefesh B'Nefesh flight in history, and he tried to convince everybody to come back with him and make Aliyah. He was somewhat successful in convincing people, not wildly so. However, he was a great leader who reinvigorated Torah learning. He reintroduced many halachas that had been forgotten since the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. He was as great of a luminary as we could have. Just how great was Ezra? So the Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us, quote, Ezra was worthy of having the Torah presented to Israel through him had Moshe not preceded him. That's what the Gemara says. Just so you get an understanding of who Ezra HaSofer was, Ezra the scribe. The 10th of Teves, when we actually fast, was the day that Nebuchadnezzar began the siege of Yerushalayim that resulted in the destruction either 30 months later, some say 40, so it's either 2.5 years later, some say 1.5 years later, some say 3.5 years later. But everybody agrees the siege started on Asara B'Teves. 6 months later, the siege was still going. 6 months later, when Shavasar B'Tammuz came out that year, that is not when they breached the walls. It was a minimum of 1.5 years after Asara B'Teves that they breached the walls. Some say 2.5 years, some say 3.5 years. Now that's hard to understand, and it's obviously a surprise, right? One that many commentators ask about. Why do we commemorate the siege that started 1.5, 2.5, 3.5 years before the destruction? I mean, think about it. We are ready fast on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, which marks the breaching of the walls. We also already fast on Tisha B'Av, which marks the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So why do we also have to fast on this day, which is an event that seems so remotely connected to the final destruction? Okay, I get it. That was the first day of the siege. But it's so far away from the actual breaching of the walls and the destruction, it's hard to understand why we need to fast on that day as well. So to begin our answer, we're going to start with the Avudraham, who tells us that in a way, and this is a reflection of what we said before, in a way, Asara B'Teves is even more significant than Tisha B'Av, in that if it would ever fall out on Shabbos, it would not be pushed off like Tisha B'Av, even though, ironically, Tisha B'Av is marking the actual destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, yet we would push it off if it came out on Shabbos. Asara B'Teves, which is just commemorating the beginning of the siege, we would fast even on Shabbos. Why? So the Rambam writes that the primary purpose of a fast is not grief and mourning, but a call for us to repent in the very areas that caused the tragedies to occur. And that's something we need to remember. It's not about the fasting. It's about taking the time to understand where we are going wrong and how we need to fix that. Rav Krem, who writes on this as well, points out that Asar B'Tevet can be explained on 3 levels. The first is that when Hashem brings punishment upon an individual or a nation, he doesn't do it all at once. At first he sends warning signs, and if the person has a sense of obligation, he takes it to heart and tries to ferret out the deeper reason behind it. Asara B'Teves was the seed that was supposed to arouse the Jews to repent. That was what we'll call the warning shot. Had they taken these warning signs appropriately, they could have prevented the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So we are not fasting so much for what occurred, but rather to rectify the coldness and apathy that settled upon the Jews and caused the destruction. When suffering comes upon us, he says, our focus should not be on the stick that hit us. The stick is just an agent, a sign from above, and we must attempt to look beyond it to rectify our deeds that caused it. Today, when we no longer have prophecy, we must pray to Hashem to open our eyes. Notice that terminology, open our eyes. We talked about the closing of eyes before. To rectify that which we need to. When Hashem sees us responding correctly, our suffering is reduced. On the second level, Asara B'Teves is the connection between the 8th and the 9th and the 10th days. These 3 days of mourning commemorate the tragedy of the weakening of the Torah. When the Greeks ordered the Torah to be translated, they caused darkness to descend upon the world. The Torah is like a rock that can be splintered in many directions. It contains layers of depth and meaning that can be interpreted in many ways. When the Torah was translated, it lost its beauty, multiplicity, and full essence. With Targum HaShivim is another way of saying the Septuagint, the translation of the 70. Ezra's work was weakened, and the inner aspect of Torah was lost, because now it allowed for the corruption of the oral law. We're starting to understand what the problem was by allowing the Torah to be translated and therefore available to everybody, because with that comes a lot of corruption of understandings and interpretations of what the Torah is saying. And if it's in the hands of the wrong people, they can use it as a very negative sword. So that's very interesting. But perhaps we can suggest even greater connections. Let me ask you something. Do you think of Teves as a sad month? We never think of it as a sad month. Why? It starts happy with Hanukkah, right? Hanukkah still bleeds into it. It's not until the 3rd that Hanukkah is over. So we still have that association of Teves with Hanukkah. Yet 3 major tragedies occurred in this month. Perhaps it is precisely that outlook that can explain why it is such an important fast day, why it's still relevant today, both literally and metaphorically, and its connection to our Parsha and this time of year. What happened when Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Yerushalayim? You know what happened? Absolutely nothing. The Jews did not do a single thing. They did not repent. They did not mourn. They mostly ignored it. They stayed snuggled in the city, almost pretending nothing was going on. They did not mend their ways. They had a great opportunity to do teshuvah and affect the outcome, and they did nothing. They saw the signs and they did nothing. I remember many years ago, I had a business that was suffering greatly. And I went to my dear friend, Rabbi Yitzchak Asuli, and I said to him, when do we say that these are obstacles that Hashem wants us to overcome? And when do we say, like the old joke about the man drowning in his house is underwater, and he gets a helicopter and a boat, and he says, Hashem will save me. It turns out Hashem was trying to save him. When do we say, God is speaking to me and telling me, get out? And when do we say, God is seeing what I'm made of and if I can overcome obstacles? So he gave me very sage advice that stays with me to this very day. He said, if in every direction you turn, you're blocked, that's when Hashem is telling you to get out. If no matter what you do, you see you're all the way, siege has been laid, so to speak, that's when you realize that's God speaking to me, telling me this is a bad situation. And that's basically what was supposed to happen. The writing was on the wall. You had the Babylonian army surrounding the city. This would be the time to take action. This would be the time to start bending our ways, doing teshuvah, reflecting. But they did absolutely nothing. And what was the effect of that? Chassam Sofer writes that on Asara B'Teves, the heavenly courts decided that this would be the beginning of the end. Okay? That was the moment that said, okay, now this destruction has begun. But the whole point was, it was a suspended sentence. We had the opportunity, let's see what we do over the course of that time before it actually has to happen. Similarly, they say, in the same vein, every year there is a judgment whether the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt again that year. Tisha B'Av already happened, but Asara B'Teves has the ability to affect the future, because Asara B'Teves stands for the proposition of warning signs of, let's get it together, let's do Teshuvah, let's reflect on how we're doing right now. That is the message of Asara B'Teves. And so now you could perhaps see the connection to Yom Kippur. Both days are very much the same. Asara B'Teves is not so much about mourning the past tragedy as it is about learning from our mistakes, about doing teshuvah, about seeing the signs and reacting. Which brings us back to our Parsha. As we said, our Parsha is a new Parsha, Parshas Vayechi. Do you know how we know that Parshas Vayechi is a new Parsha, like we asked at the beginning? To quote the Mizrahi, who asked the question, this we have as a tradition handed down by, you guessed it, Ezra HaSofer. Ezra is the one who told us that this is a new Parsha, says the Mizrahi, the incontestable authority on these matters. So are the words of the Mizrahi. So we see, how do we know it's Parshas Vayechi? Because Ezra HaSofer told us. And why were Yaakov and the tribes already sad? Their eyes and hearts already closed? Because they saw the writing on the wall. It was decades before the slavery would begin, but already they saw it coming. They felt it coming. And that is a talent that we lost during the siege of Yerushalayim, and we continue to look for it to this very day. That is the connection to our Parsha. Its representation as a time of Teshuvah is why and its representation as a time of Teshuvah is why it's relevant today. As for the time of year, as we said, who thinks of Teves as a sad month? We had Hanukkah starting out very happy, but it ends with three major tragedies. That is precisely what we must be on guard for. We think we're snug and secure in our walls, but we must be ever vigilant. We think it's all fun and Hanukkah, but we need to look out what's ahead. Why this time of year? It's a transition between Hanukkah and Purim. I don't know if you've ever contemplated this, but I believe it's Kitzer Shulchan Aruch who brings this down very out of character for him. He notes the difference between Hanukkah and Purim. What is our symbol of Hanukkah? The dreidel, right? Now, what's our miracle of Hanukkah? We got the light, but we needed help from above, right? The miracle was we only had oil enough for one day, or whatever version you want of that, and Hashem made a miracle, and it was enough to last 8 days. Therefore, our symbol is the dreidel. Why? Where is the handle on the dreidel? From the top. When we spin it, we're acknowledging the help was from the top. Purim, what happened on Purim? Although darkness descended, although it was now the time of Hester Punim, where God was now hidden, so to speak, there were no more open miracles, Ezra then dies, and there's no more Nevuah, but we brought the miracle about ourselves. We ourselves did our hishtadlus, and not only that, we fought the war and we won the war. Therefore, what is the symbol of Purim? The Grager. Where is the handle on the Grager? From below. It's on the bottom. That represents that this was a miracle that we brought about from below. Now we need to bring the light of Mashiach to brighten our eyes. We were blind on Asara B'Teves, but now we must see. That may be why Yaakov wasn't allowed to tell when the end of days was, meaning when Mashiach's arrival would be, and that darkness came upon him, or his eyes were closed. Because in the end, although Hashem decrees when Mashiach will come, it's ultimately up to us. We need to bring the light ourselves. That may be why we need this transition from Hanukkah to the 10th of Teves to Purim. and why Purim will be the only holiday celebrated in the times of Mashiach. Because it represents our ability to see through the darkness, the Hester Panim, to see the hidden signs and the hidden hand of Hashem and overcome those obstacles. And that may be why we say Purim will be the only holiday at the time of Mashiach, not Hanukkah. We want Mashiach to come because of us, like the Grager, not because of a nace from above. The lights of Hanukkah were lit by Hashem. The 10th of Teves warns us not to sit with our eyes closed in darkness, but to get up, do teshuvah, take action, and prepare for the ultimate holiday of Purim, when we reestablished our commitment to the Torah, especially the oral law, as promulgated by Ezra and as darkened by the Septuagint. So let us now prepare to bring the ultimate light to the world, not that of Hanukkah, but of Mashiach. Good Shabbos.